Hello and welcome to our webinar on No Tricks, Just Tips, Mastering Medicare Documentation. My name is Jennifer Boniface and I am one of the nurse analysts with the Provider Outreach and Education team. During today's webinar, we're going to focus on documentation for Medicare. So I have a few housekeeping items to go over with you before we start the webinar. You can find the link to the encore presentation of this webinar on our website's Training Center page at www.wpsgha.com, and it will be accessible for the next 60 to 90 days. Additionally, the recording will be uploaded to our YouTube channel under both the Medicare Education Expo and the Encore Presentations playlist, and both should be available within the next 15 business days. If you have any questions, please put those questions into the chat, and we will answer questions as time permits. Additionally, we'll be holding a dedicated Q&A session titled Frights and Insights Follow-Up Q&A on October 21st at 1 p.m. Central Time, 2 p.m. Eastern Time to ensure all your questions are fully answered. And you can register for this session on our live events page located within the Training Center on our website. We really want your feedback. It helps us develop the education on topics that may be of interest to you. Consider taking our survey to let CMS know what you did like and what topics you'd like to learn more about. And Mary Sue is going to place a link to the survey into the chat. There will also be an opportunity at the end to take the survey. Additionally, you can provide feedback by completing the survey while viewing the encore presentation. To access the survey, click the circle with the eye in the upper right corner of the video. And a link to the survey can also be found in the description of the video. On our next slide, we have our disclaimer. Medicare rules change often, so please make sure you're looking at official CMS communications for the most up-to-date rules and regulations, and these do take precedence over anything presented today. And as a reminder, CMS prohibits recording of this presentation for profit-making purposes. This presentation is being recorded by us and will be posted on the Training Center page of our website under Encore Presentations, as well as on the YouTube channel under the playlist Encore Presentations. On the next slide, you'll notice several acronyms that will be used throughout this presentation. While you may already be familiar with many of them, feel free to refer to the slide if you come across an acronym you don't recognize. So let's get started. Accurate and thorough documentation is essential in Medicare. We've all heard the phrase, if it's not documented, it wasn't done. And when it comes to Medicare documentation, this statement is especially true. Proper documentation is more than just a requirement. It serves as an essential tool to accurately and effectively tell the patient's story. It helps explain what was done, why it was done, and how the patient responded. This level of clarity not only enhances clinical communication, but also safeguards against issues, particularly if the claim is ever audited by CMS or a Medicare contractor. So thorough and accurate documentation isn't just good practice. It is essential for accountability, compliance, and ultimately high-quality patient care. Our objective for today is to provide an overview of Medicare documentation best practices to ensure accurate claims, minimize denials, and effectively respond to additional documentation requests. And we will cover best practices for Medicare documentation using the 5 Ws, common documentation errors and how to prevent them, common denial codes and how to avoid them, and how to submit documentation for ADRs. Let's begin by exploring why accurate documentation is so essential. Thorough and precise documentation plays a critical role in ensuring the integrity and usefulness of clinical data. Accurate documentation serves several purposes. It verifies the care billed was actually provided and meets Medicare's coverage requirements. It helps demonstrate that patients are receiving appropriate, high-quality care. An accurate record supports correct billing and helps ensure a provider receives proper reimbursement for the service delivered. It also provides the necessary evidence to support the medical necessity of a test, procedure, or treatment. In addition, detailed documentation helps providers remain compliant with Medicare rules and regulatory standards. And finally, it strengthens communication within the care team, ensuring continuity and clarity in patient care. Let's briefly go over the essential elements of effective medical documentation, which can be remembered through the 5 key questions: who, what, where, when, and why. Each of these play a crucial role in ensuring that documentation is complete, accurate, and meets Medicare's requirements. And we'll start with who. Documentation should clearly identify who performed the service, who supervised it, who the referring provider was, and who the patient or beneficiary was. For the beneficiary, it is important to include identifying details such as their full name, date of birth, health insurance claim number, and the Medicare beneficiary identifier. Next are what and how many. The documentation should accurately describe the services that were provided, the quantity of those services, and the clinical justification for any additional care delivered. It should also include specifics such as the time spent, tests performed, procedures carried out, and dosages administered. The third W is where. The location of the service must be clearly documented, specifying whether it occurred in a medical office, an outside lab, an outpatient facility, a patient's home, or another setting. If the service was provided across multiple locations, such as an office visit followed by imaging at a separate facility, this should also be properly noted in the record. The next W is when. The timing of the service must be accurately recorded, including both the date and time it was performed. While this might seem like a minor detail, it is important for ensuring accuracy, support and continuity of care, and meeting reimbursement requirements. And finally, the last W is why. The reason for performing the service should be well documented, highlighting the medical necessity behind it. This includes noting the patient's diagnosis, symptoms, or any relevant medical conditions that support the need for the service. Such documentation demonstrates the care provided was reasonable, necessary, and consistent with accepted standards of practice. By making sure that documentation addresses all 5 W's, who, what, where, when, and why, providers can ensure that their records are complete, reliable, and compliant. Ultimately, this supports accurate billing, appropriate reimbursement, and the delivery of high-quality patient care. And before we move on, let's take a quick look at what the medical review process involves. The medical review program is carried out by Medicare contractors to help prevent incorrect payments and safeguard the Medicare Trust Fund. As part of this effort, medical records and related documentation are collected and examined to confirm that payments are made only for services that meets Medicare's coverage, coding, billing, and medical necessity standards. Errors may be identified during the claims analysis phase, the medical review process, or both. Contractors use these findings to ensure payment accuracy and to recover any improper payments made. They also provide education to encourage compliance going forward. And remember, part of the conditions of participation is to submit documentation when requested by any of these review contractors. Now that we've covered the purpose of medical review, let's take a look at some of the common errors we frequently see in documentation. There are several common errors that we continue to observe in submitted documentation. The first common error is late entries. Next is issues with signatures. The third common error is no documentation sent by the provider or facility. The last common documentation error involves providing services that do not meet Medicare's coverage guidelines for medical necessity. And we're going to review each of these errors in more detail and share some tips on how to avoid them. The first type of documentation error we will discuss is late entries. In Medicare documentation, late entries refer to notes or information added to a patient's medical record after the original date of service. While Medicare permits late entries, they must be clearly dated and signed on the actual date they are written, with a direct reference to the date the service or observation took place. A valid explanation for a late entry should be included to promote transparency and uphold the integrity of the medical record. Late entries must never be backdated, and the reason for the delay should be clearly documented, particularly if the entry is part of a Medicare audit or appeal. When performed correctly, late entries can provide important clarifications or additional details that support medical necessity. However, if they appear inconsistent, vague, or suspicious, late entries may lead to claim denials or raise concerns during a medical review. To minimize these risks, providers should maintain a clear audit trail and submit any late documentation promptly, along with an appropriate explanation when required. The next type of documentation error involves issues related to provider signatures. These errors can take several forms, including illegible handwritten signatures, missing provider signatures, or absent supervising signatures when required for services performed under supervision. Additionally, unauthenticated medical records or those lacking any form of signature or verification are also a common issue. Electronic signatures can lead to denials if they do not meet the requirements outlined in Medicare's electronic health record protocols. This includes failing to indicate the date and time of the signature or using signature formats that lack authentication measures, such as a secure login or an audit trail that shows who signed the record and when. To prevent signature-related documentation issues, it's essential that all medical record entries are signed, dated, and include the time when required by CMS guidelines. Medicare accepts both handwritten and electronic signatures. Signatures must be legible. If a signature is unclear, a signature log or attestation statement can be submitted to verify the verify the signer's identity. A signature log typically includes a list of providers' names typed alongside their corresponding handwritten signatures. An attestation statement can confirm the provider's identity, detailing the patient and the medical record being referenced. For electronic signatures, providers must indicate that the signature was applied electronically along with the record itself and document the date and time of authentication for audit purposes. Electronic signature systems must also be secure with proper safeguards like password protection and user authentication to prevent unauthorized access. Stamped signatures are generally not accepted except for providers with documented physical disabilities that prevent handwritten signatures. In such cases, proof of the disability must be submitted to the CMS contractor. Additionally, all medical records must clearly show the date the service was ordered or performed. If an entry lacks a date but is surrounded by dated entries immediately above and below it, the date of entry in question can be reasonably inferred upon medical review. If a record lacks a signature or is not signed promptly after the date of service, it is considered incomplete. In such cases, providers may include an attestation statement when responding to a documentation request to clarify authorship. And for additional guidance on Medicare signature requirements, please refer to the Medicare Program Integrity Manual, Chapter 3, Section 3.3.2.4, MLN 905364, complying with Medicare signature requirements, and WPS's Guidance for Provider Signature Requirements. And links to these resources are provided on the resources slide at the end of the presentation. Next, let's review the supervising physician's responsibilities when signing off on clinical notes. The supervising physician must review and approve both the care and documentation provided by non-physician practitioners under their supervision. By signing, they confirm agreement that the clinical decisions are correct, validate the accuracy of the record, and ensure treatment aligns with the established medical standards. They also verify the documentation meets clinical and legal requirements. They provide feedback and guidance and ensure the healthcare provider is practicing within their scope of training and competency. Ultimately, the supervising physician takes responsibility for the care provided and confirms their agreement with both the treatment and the documentation. Before we proceed to the next documentation error, I would like to also address another often overlooked but critically important aspect of documentation, cloning within the electronic medical record. While this feature can save time and improve consistency, It also carries significant risks if not properly used. Cloning, also known as copy and paste, copy forward, or cut and paste, is a common EMR function used to replicate clinical information efficiently. When used properly, it can streamline documentation by carrying forward accurate and consistent data, such as updated medication lists and past medical histories. However, improper use of cloning poses serious risks. Copying without verification can lead to outdated, redundant, or false documentation, compromising patient safety, quality of care, and compliance. CMS warns that clone notes lacking patient-specific details may misrepresent services, potentially leading to inaccurate coding, including upcoding, and even fraud. To mitigate these risks, CMS and the American Medical Association recommend carefully reviewing and updating all copied content, ensuring each note reflects the current encounter and medical necessity, training staff and establishing clear documentation policies, using EMR tools to flag cloned content, such as use of highlights or citations, and performing regular documentation audits. Responsible use of cloning is essential to maintain accurate, individualized, and compliant medical records. For further guidance on cloning, please refer to CMS's resource Ensuring Proper Use of Electronic Health Records Features and Capabilities Decision Table, and a link has been provided on the bottom of the slide. The third type of documentation error is failure to submit required documentation. Providers should respond to additional documentation requests within the specific timeframes. It is important to note that the countdown starts from the date of the ADR letter, not when the provider receives it. For MAC prepay reviews, providers have 45 days to respond. For MAC SMRC and RAC post-payment reviews, the response window is also 45 calendar days. However, when it comes to UPIC payment, prepayment, and post-payment reviews, the time frame is shorter, just 30 calendar days. If a provider fails to submit documentation within the required time, the contractor has the authority to deny the claim with a 56900 or M127 denial code, indicating no documentation received within the specified time frame. This type of denial is not related to medical necessity and is not appealable. The 56900 denial code indicates no documentation was received within the specified ADR response period. Remittance Advice Remark Code M127 is commonly paired with Claim Adjustment Reason Code 56900 to indicate the claim was denied because the necessary medical documentation for the billed service was not submitted. And for more information about the 56900 and M127 codes, please view our Encore presentation titled Encore No Documentation Received Denials 56900 and M127, and a link has been placed on the resources slide at the end of the presentation so you can view that one. When Medicare denies a claim due to not supporting medical necessity, it means the submitted documentation does not sufficiently demonstrate that the services were reasonable, necessary, and appropriate for the patient's condition. This claim typically does not meet the coverage criteria outlined in local coverage determinations or national coverage determinations. Medicare requires services to be justified based on the patient's symptoms, diagnoses, and clinical findings. This includes providing evidence that the service is consistent with accepted standards of medical practice and that directly relates to the treatment or evaluation of the patient's condition. Lack of detailed progress notes, diagnostic results, or clinical evidence can lead to a denial, as can services deemed experimental or unsupported by evidence-based guidelines. To appeal, providers must submit comprehensive documentation that outlines the clinical rationale for the service, including relevant notes, findings, and treatment protocols. Inadequate documentation not only leads to denials, but can also impact patient care and reimbursement integrity. And Just as a side, just saw that there was a question that asked about explaining when to use an NCD and LCD. We do have our last Medicare Expo did discuss NCDs and LCDs thoroughly, so I would refer you to that. But the way to tell is by going to our website, and I'm just going to briefly show you that just so you can know where to locate it. If you go to our website and you look under the code lookup tool and you put in a description, if you put LCD and you put up in a description, and I'll just put skin just for example. It should bring up if we have an LCD. If for some reason it does not bring up an LCD, which is our local ones, the ones that WPS creates, then we can do NCD and look it up there, and you might find ones for both. But again, that's probably the best way you can tell whether you need to use whether to use an LCD or an NCD. So I'm going to go back, and I hope that explained it. And again, I would refer you to watching those webinars, because we have a whole expo devoted only to LCDs and LCDs. NCDs and LCDs and NCDs. That was a tongue twister there. So now we're going to start discussing more common denial reasons that we encounter. For Medicare Part A, the first most common denial we encounter is for insufficient documentation. The reason code GAI 01, which states provider did not submit all records requested, indicates that Medicare or its contractors requested specific medical records or documentation to support a claim, but the provider failed to submit the complete set of requested information. This incomplete response often results in a denial or partial denial of the claim because Medicare or its contractors cannot adequately verify the medical necessity, appropriateness, or accuracy of the billed services without full documentation. When an additional documentation request is issued, it outlines precisely what records or information the provider must supply, such as progress notes, lab reports, test results, and operative reports. And that was a pre-submitted question, so I want you to understand we do outline it in the ADR. If any portion of these records is missing, unclear, or not submitted within the required time frame, the claim is likely to be denied under the GAI 01. To resolve this denial, providers should carefully review the original request, gather all relevant documentation, and submit a complete response. Timely, thorough submissions improve claim approval chances and ensure compliance with Medicare's auditing and review processes. Failure to comply may also increase the risk for further audits or investigations. The other common denial reason code for Part A related to insufficient documentation is GAI 02, which indicates provider did not submit additional records requested. This occurs when, following the initial submission of medical records in response to a documentation request, it is determined that further documentation is needed to fully evaluate the claim. If the provider fails to submit the requested additional documentation, the claim may be denied or reduced. Medicare requires complete and thorough documentation to justify the services billed, and failure to supply additional documentation upon request can lead to claim denial or reduction. To address a GAI 02 denial, providers should carefully review the subsequent request, gather all additional information, and submit a complete, organized response. Timely submission of the requested records helps to ensure a more accurate claim review and increases the likelihood of payment. Ignoring the request or failing to respond fully may result in continued denials, delayed reimbursement, or further audits or appeals. For Medicare Parts A and B, the other most common denial we encounter is not supporting medical necessity. These denials occur when the documentation submitted with the claim does not sufficiently demonstrate that the services or items provided were reasonable, necessary, and in accordance with established medical guidelines. Under Medicare Part A, two of the most frequently issued denial reason codes related to medical necessity are GAJ01 and GAJ04. These denials indicate the submitted documentation did not meet the medical necessity requirements as defined by Medicare guidelines. GAJ01 indicates the documentation submitted does not support the medical necessity as listed in coverage requirements. This typically means that the medical records lack sufficient evidence to justify the need for the inpatient services billed, such as missing physician orders, incomplete clinical assessments, or failure to demonstrate that the condition met inpatient criteria. GAJ04 indicates that the documentation submitted does not support the need for this many services or items within this period of time. This denial often arises in cases where repeat services or prolonged inpatient stays are billed without sufficient medical justification for the necessity, suggesting possible overutilization or lack of clinical complexity to warrant the volume of services rendered. For Part B, the most common denial reason code we encounter for not supporting medical necessity is GBC01. This denial reason code applies when the submitted documentation fails to support the medical necessity as defined by the coverage requirements outlined in the National Coverage Determination or Local Coverage Determination. It is typically used when there is insufficient clinical evidence or when the documentation does not meet the specific policy criteria to justify the service. Medicare requires that the clinical record clearly demonstrates that the service or item provided is reasonable and necessary for the diagnosis or treatment of an illness or injury in accordance with established national or local coverage determination guidelines. Failure to meet these standards can result in claim denials. To help avoid medical necessity denials such as GAJ01, GAJ04, and GBC01, providers can take several steps focused on documentation, compliance, and education. First, it's essential to understand and stay up to date with national coverage determinations and local coverage determinations relevant to the services being provided. Thorough and accurate clinical documentation should clearly demonstrate the medical necessity of the service or level of care by including the patient's condition, symptoms, test results, relevant clinical information, and the clinical rationale supporting the need for the treatment or services provided. Ensure the diagnosis codes accurately reflect and support the medical necessity of each service rendered by selecting the correct ICD-10 code. Prior to delivering services, providers should verify that medical necessity is met and obtain prior authorization if required. Ongoing education for both clinical and billing staff is also crucial to reinforce documentation standards and policy updates. Additionally, performing internal audits to monitor for trends and denials can help identify and correct recurring issues. Should the provider decide to appeal this decision, they should be prepared to submit comprehensive supporting documentation if the services were truly medically necessary. Taking these steps can significantly reduce the risk of denials and promote smoother claim processing. If additional information is required to make an initial claim determination, our medical review department may request medical documentation from the billing provider. And I will start by giving a brief overview of the process, and then I'll show you where to find more detailed information on our website in the following slides. Billing providers are required to submit the requested documentation to the Medicare administrator contractor within 45 days from the date on the additional documentation request letter. If the documentation is not submitted within this time frame, the claim is typically processed without the necessary information, which often results in a denial or rejection. A medical review calculator is available on our website to help providers determine the deadline for submitting documentation. To use it, select Additional Documentation Request from the drop-down menu titled Date, select Date to be calculated, then enter the initial date. The tool will calculate the submission deadline for you, and I have included a link to that goes directly to that calculator. ADR letters are sent to providers via United States Postal Service. Registered WPS SNAP users in jurisdictions J5 and J8 can also access ADR letters in the portal. Providers may respond to an ADR either through the portal or by mailing the documentation as hard copies or on a CD/DVD. Let's now go over the process for submitting documentation for medical review. There are multiple submission methods available. In this documentation, I'll walk you through the steps for submitting documentation for the ADR. So from the home page, navigate to the top of this page and open the drop-down menu under Topics Center. Here you'll see a list of topics, and we want medical review. So we'll click on medical review, and that will take us to the medical review Topics Center. And we have a wealth of information in here. Right here, I want you to pay notice to this responding to medical review additional documentation request. And that's going to detail you how to how to submit that documentation, and we will go over that. Also, if you go under documentation submission, you can find some additional resources. Again, you'll see that documentation request, how to submit it, document. And we also have a document about how to use the portal to submit those prepayment, postpayment, and prior auth review documentation. So now let's review the different methods for submitting documentation. These options are outlined in our resource, Responding to Medical Review Additional Documentation Requests. And I'm going to review some of that key information in there. So I am going to scroll down to Responding. Again, we do have some information about when you receive it, which is some very good information to look at as well. But I'm going to go to that Responding portion. So the preferred method for submitting medical records is through the portal. And you can find detailed instructions for submitting documentation for an ADR request in the WPS SecureNet Access Portal User Manual, which you can find right here. When submitting through the portal, please note that only one file can be uploaded per claim, and the file size must not exceed 50 megabytes. And if you need to submit multiple files, they must be compressed in a single zip file containing no more than 60 files. Another method for submission of documentation is through the mail. This can be performed one of two ways, either by mailing a hard copy paper documentation or by mailing documentation on a CD, DVD. For hard copy paper documentation, you may include documentation for multiple claims in one envelope or package. When submitting multiple ADR responses, clip, do not staple the documentation for each claim separately. Use full sheets of one-sided paper. Do not submit half sheets or double-sided pages. If your facility uses double-sided forms, ensure the beneficiary's name appears on each page. When submitting documentation on a CD, DVD, name image files with the appropriate identifiers, such as a Medicare number and claim number. All images must be contained in password-protected zip files. Email the password, mail tracking number if applicable, and the date the documentation was sent to mr.adr.passwords@wpsic.com. And that email should be sent on the same day or the next day after mailing the CD, DVD. And again, if you click on it, it will take you right to doing that email. For mailing confidential information, consider these safeguards. Label the CD, DVD as restricted and/or confidential, and keep a shipment record in case the package is lost or gets lost. And the medical review emailing address can be found right here. So right here we have that in our document, in our resource. Providers can also submit documentation through fax. Fax documentation for each request letter separately. Do not send multiple requests in a single fax. Wait for confirmation that your fax successfully transmitted before sending the next document. Sending faxes too quickly without adequate time between submissions may cause delay in processing. Only fax full sheets of one-sided paper. Do not fax half sheets or double-sided pages. And the fax number is listed right here on the resource. Finally, WPS also accepts documentation through the Electronic Submission of Medical Documentation ESMD system. And for more details about this process, visit the resource Electronic Submission of Medical Documentation ESMD on the CMS website. For all methods of documentation submission, be sure to include the request letter as the first page of your documentation packet. If the request letter is unavailable, provide a provider-generated letter with the following details: the beneficiary's Medicare number, date of service, and clear indication that the documentation is for medical review. We have recently observed that providers are submitting additional documentation in response to claim inquiries. However, they often fail to include a cover sheet, an additional documentation request letter, or any identifying information indicating where the documentation should be directed. When this occurs, the lack of identifiable information makes it difficult for staff processing the documents to determine the appropriate department or team to receive the information. As a result, important documentation may not be properly associated with the corresponding claim, increasing the risk of claim denials. To prevent such issues, providers should always include a copy of the ADR letter on top of the submitted documentation when responding to a request. This helps ensure that documentation is correctly routed to the appropriate department for review. Another option is for providers to use a cover sheet, which is typically provided to them, to clearly identify the claim and explain the purpose of their submission. Following these best practices improves the efficiency of claim processing and reduces the chances of errors or denials. Before we wrap up, I would like to quickly highlight 3 key initiatives under CMS's Improving Provider Experience program designed to reduce administrative burdens for healthcare providers. First is electronic submission of medical documentation, or ESMD, which allows providers to submit documentation electronically to review contractors, eliminating the need for mailing or faxing. Next, the documentation requirement simplification under the Patient over Paperwork initiative seeks to streamline and eliminate unnecessary sub-regulatory documentation requirements, making it easier for providers to focus on patient care rather than complex paperwork. The final initiative, Documentation Requirement Lookup Service, lets providers electronically search for coverage and coding requirements, helping to reduce documentation burdens, minimize improper payments, and improve communication between providers and payers. Accurate documentation goes beyond just meeting requirements. It provides a comprehensive record of the patient's care journey, detailing the actions taken, the reasons behind them, and the patient's response. This thoroughness confirms that the billed services were actually performed and meet Medicare's coverage criteria, support billing and reimbursement, and justifies the medical necessity of treatments and tests. In addition to enhancing communication among healthcare teams, thorough documentation safeguards providers during Medicare reviews and helps maintain compliance with regulations. Ultimately, it is essential for accountability, compliance, and delivering safe, high-quality care. So as a recap, during today's webinar, we discussed best practices for medical documentation using the 5 Ws, viewed common documentation errors and how to prevent them, discussed common denial codes and how to avoid them, and explained how to submit documentation for ADRs. This slide includes key resources referenced in the presentation, such as the Medicare Program Integrity Manual, Chapter 3, MLN 905364, Complying with Medicare Signature Requirements, WPS resources offering guidance on signature requirements and documentation tips, and the Encore presentation, No Documentation Received Denials 56900 and M127. Additionally, I did include our YouTube playlists and then gave you a link for that. So please refer to this slide and use it as a reference when reviewing the presentation. So we're now at the end of the formal presentation. Before we go to questions in the chat, I want to take a moment to address 2 pre-submitted questions we received. The first question asks, is it ever appropriate for another provider to sign a different doctor's chart in the event the original rendering provider left or was terminated from the practice? And it is not appropriate for any other provider to sign documentation on behalf of another provider who is no longer in the practice if they did not directly render or supervise the care and was not directly involved with the patient's care. And our next question asked, how should a provider attest when working with a resident or house officer? And how do they attest when they are not present with a resident and house officer? When working with a resident or house officer, the provider must attest that they were physically present for key portions of the service and document their involvement and agreement with the resident's findings and treatment plan. If the provider was not present during the service, they must personally evaluate the patient, perform the key portions themselves, and document their own findings. They may state that the resident's care was reviewed and discussed with them, that they agree with the findings and plan, and any modifications are noted. And it looks like we're approaching the end of the webinar, and I know your time is valuable and you want to attend some other sessions later on the day. So I do really appreciate you staying with me for this topic. However, to stay on schedule, I am going to move on. However, we did not address any of your questions or did not address your question today during the presentation, we will cover questions related to general Medicare documentation in our dedicated Q&A session, Frights and Insights Follow-Up Q&A on October 21st at 1 p.m. Central Time, 2 p.m. Eastern Time. And if we didn't get to your questions today during the presentation, we will also send out a document to all participants with the answers following this webinar. So for those attending today's live event, in a few minutes, you will receive an email thanking you for attending. And this email looks like what you see on the left-hand side of your screen. Do not delete it without reading it. This email does contain your certificate of achievement, as well as a link to take the survey. And if you haven't completed it already, please take a few moments to complete this customer satisfaction survey. The contact hours for this event can be found in this email should you require them for earning credit toward continuing education units. If you don't see it, please check your junk or spam folder. Make sure to add the WebEx email address messenger@webex.com to your safe sender, safe receiver list to avoid these emails going to junk or spam. And if you called into this webinar, just email us at wps.gha.education@wpsic.com with the name of this webinar and the phone number you used to log in, and we can email you your certificate of achievement. Following today's live event, if you think of any additional questions, you have 7 days from today to submit them. Send them to our education mailbox at wps.gha.education@wpsic.com and put Medicare documentation in the subject line. However, if you have claim-specific questions, please do not send those to Provider Outreach and Education. Please direct those questions to our customer service department, as we do not have access to your claim information and therefore unable to look up claims. Also remember, we cannot accept any type of PHI or PII via email. If you haven't done so already, please take a few minutes now to complete a survey. Share with CMS and us about your experience today. Tell us about your experience, including what you liked, what we could do to improve, and suggestions for future education. We use your feedback to develop topics for future education events. There are several different options you can use to take the survey, depending on your preference. For those attending today's live event, the first option is to click the survey link in the chat. And the other option is to take the survey in the CMS Qualtrics page. So when you exit the webinar, you'll be asked to go to an external site, and that external site is that CMS Qualtrics page. It looks like what you see here with that little yellow triangle. It is not spam, it's actually directing you to our survey. And we'll also add a survey link to the Encore presentation. Just click on the survey picture at the end of the Encore presentation video to take our customer satisfaction survey. And based on your feedback, we've added several enhanced features to improve your education experience. Our Encore presentation videos now include chapters, making it easier for you to find key information quickly. We've also introduced training indicators during the webinar registration to help you identify the intended audience for each session. And we do hope these enhancements make your learning experience even more valuable and accessible. So on behalf of myself, Mary Sue, Provider Outreach and Education, and Medical Review, thank you for attending today's webinar on No Tricks, Just Tips, Mastering Medicare Documentation. As a reminder, this presentation will be posted as an Encore presentation on the Training Center page on our website. Please make sure you attend our other sessions. They are also very valuable information, and also attend our Frights and Insights follow-up Q&A session on October 21st. Remember to take our survey with the links provided. We look forward to your survey comments and hope to have you join us at future events. You may now disconnect.